They said he was just a truck driver. But truck drivers don't make union bosses disappear. That's how the legend of Frank the Irishman Sheeran begins, half truth, half confession, all blood. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories from the underworld. Frank wasn't born into crime. He was born into war, a soldier who learned in Italy that orders came before mercy. When he came home to Pennsylvania, he drove trucks, kept quiet, and watched men like Russell Bufalino move mountains without raising their voices. "I paint houses," Frank once said, code for what he really did, kill on command. But back then, he was still a man searching for purpose, not permission. The bars smelled of gasoline and whiskey. Deals were whispered between coughs of cigarette smoke. And in that blur of post-war America, loyalty looked like opportunity. Frank didn't know it yet, but his hands, steady from war, would soon carry the weight of history. Because one handshake would tie him to Jimmy Hoffa, and one order would make him vanish forever. Frank Sheeran wasn't born ruthless. He was born restless. In Darby, Pennsylvania, a working-class Irish neighborhood, life was simple until it wasn't. His father worked hard, his mother prayed harder, and Frank learned early that talk was cheap but loyalty had a cost. He grew tall, quiet, and detached, the kind of man who could watch a fight without blinking. By the time he turned 16, he'd already seen the world through hungry eyes. When World War II came, he didn't hesitate. "If there's a job to do, I'll do it," he told his mother before boarding the train. Italy hardened him. He saw men die for orders, not reasons. And something in him changed. Mercy became optional, discipline became survival. When he came home, he couldn't fit into ordinary life. Driving trucks was just a cover. What he really carried was the habit of obeying men with power. Russell Bufalino saw that in him, the calm, the obedience, the soldier's silence. "You're a good man to have around," Russell said once. And Frank took that as scripture. He believed loyalty could build an empire. He didn't realize it could also dig a grave. It started small, a favor for a friend, a delivery that didn't need a receipt. Frank knew better than to ask questions. You didn't survive in Bufalino territory by being curious. He was a driver with perfect timing and no mistakes. Soon, those deliveries turned into messages, and those messages turned into warnings, the kind written in silence and settled with bullets. "I paint houses," Frank would say with that flat calm only men like him could pull off. It meant blood work. It meant loyalty with a gun in its hand. Jimmy Hoffa came next, loud, proud, and impossible to ignore. Hoffa saw something in Frank, a man who could handle the dirty work without losing sleep. "You're my kind of guy," Hoffa told him over steak and scotch. That night, a bond was born, one built on loyalty, and sealed in secrets. For the first time, Frank wasn't just following orders, he was part of the machine that made them. Money flowed. Respect followed. And power? It came quietly, wrapped in trust and fear. But the higher he climbed, the more the ground beneath him began to shift. And somewhere in that climb, someone started watching. By the late 1950s, Frank Sheeran wasn't just a driver anymore, he was a name people whispered. He moved through smoky diners, Teamster halls, and backroom poker tables like a man without nerves. When Hoffa walked in, people stood up. When Frank walked in, they stayed quiet. He became the bridge between the mob's discipline and the union's muscle. If Russell Bufalino wanted peace, Frank arranged it. If Hoffa wanted someone straightened out, Frank made it happen without noise. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but everyone knew he could make problems disappear. At night, he'd sit alone, polishing his shoes, replaying Hoffa's words, "You take care of the ones who take care of you." It sounded simple, almost noble. But Frank knew what it really meant. Loyalty was just another word for control. Power didn't feel like fire, it felt like still water, calm on the surface, deadly underneath. And for a while, Frank believed he could balance both worlds, mob and union, Bufalino and Hoffa, without drowning in either. He was wrong. Because power doesn't just give, it collects. power brings comfort and danger in disguise. By the early 1970s, the quiet balance Frank had built started to tilt. Hoffa, once untouchable, was slipping. The government was closing in, and the mob wanted distance. Frank stood between two worlds, Hoffa's loyalty and Bufalino's control. The two men who made him were now enemies. And he, the soldier, couldn't serve both generals. "You gotta pick a side, Frank," a Union man whispered once. Frank didn't answer. He didn't have to. Hoffa had grown louder, angrier, shouting about betrayal, about mob influence, about taking back what was his. Frank tried to calm him. "Jimmy, you're pushing too hard," he warned. But Hoffa just leaned closer. "I made them powerful, Frank. They owe me." For the first time, Frank saw fear in the man he once admired, not fear of death, but of being forgotten. In the shadows, Russell Bufalino stayed silent, watching his protégé struggle with loyalty and guilt. The silence between them grew heavier than any command. Frank still believed he could save both sides. He didn't realize he was already the weapon in someone else's plan. By 1975, paranoia was the new currency. Everyone owed it, and no one could afford to lose it. Phones clicked. Cars lingered. Conversations felt staged. The FBI wasn't just watching Hoffa, they were watching everyone who had ever stood near him. Frank started noticing the small things. The same sedan parked across from his house. The same man pretending to read the same newspaper. When he mentioned it to Bufalino, Russell only said, "If they're watching, it's because they're late." Still, Frank's nights grew longer. The phone would ring, and nobody spoke. Even Hoffa sounded different, desperate, cornered. "They're all rats, Frank," he said once. "But not you. You're still my guy." Frank wanted to believe that. But every meeting, every whispered deal, carried the smell of setup. He could feel it, the world around him tightening like a noose. In smoky diners, men stopped shaking hands. In Teamster offices, doors stayed half open. Trust became a relic of the past. And through it all, Frank's loyalty became his greatest vulnerability. He told himself he'd never betray Hoffa. He just didn't know what betrayal would look like when it finally arrived. The summer of 1975 burned hot and tense. Hoffa was fighting ghosts, the mob, the government, and his own fading power. He wanted his throne back, and he wanted Frank by his side. "Russell's with me, right?" Hoffa asked one afternoon, his voice trembling with pride and denial. Frank hesitated, that 1 second too long. Hoffa caught it. "You tell him," Hoffa said sharply. "I'm not backing down." That night, Bufalino called. The tone was soft, almost fatherly. "There's a meeting," he said. "Detroit. You'll go with Jimmy. Make sure he's calm." Frank understood the words that weren't spoken. There was no meeting. There was a decision. And he was part of it. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Hoffa climbed into the car like always, still talking about loyalty, about taking back control. Frank just nodded, his hands steady on his lap. They drove through quiet suburbs, toward a house that wasn't marked, toward a future that was already written. Inside, Hoffa's voice echoed once, surprised, confused, and then silence took over. Frank walked out alone. And the world never saw Jimmy Hoffa again. They say every man meets himself in silence. Frank met his in prison. The fall came quietly. Years after Hoffa's disappearance, the walls closed in. The FBI couldn't prove the murder, but they had enough to bury him in other crimes, racketeering, extortion, the old sins finally catching up. Inside, time didn't pass, it lingered. The clang of doors, the smell of cold metal, the echo of his own footsteps. He followed the same routine every day, wake up early, shine his shoes, say nothing. It was the same discipline that once made him powerful, now it was just survival. Some guards treated him with respect, others with disgust. "You really did it, didn't you?" one whispered. Frank just stared at the wall. He'd stopped defending himself long ago. Russell Bufalino was there too, older, weaker, but still commanding silence in the cafeteria. The two men sat together sometimes, not talking. They didn't need to. The past was already loud enough. When Bufalino died behind bars, Frank didn't cry. He just whispered, "We kept our word." But deep down, he knew loyalty had cost him everything. And for the first time, he wondered if silence was truly peace or punishment. When Frank finally walked out of prison, the world had moved on. The streets were cleaner, the cars quieter, and the names he once feared were now stories told by men with gray hair and shaky hands. The mob had faded into history, but the ghosts remained. He lived alone in a small apartment, a recliner by the window, a rosary on the table. Every morning, he'd polish his shoes, the same ritual from his days with Hoffa, from the army, from the life he could never escape. Reporters came and went, asking about Hoffa, about Bufalino, about the blood behind the loyalty. Frank would give half answers, then light a cigarette. "Let's just say I was around," he'd murmur, eyes drifting toward nothing. Age softened his voice, but not his memory. He'd talk about duty, about doing what needed to be done. Yet there was a weight in his words, a tiredness no sentence could capture. The world called him the Irishman. But he saw himself as something else, a man who traded peace for belonging, and found neither. He survived everyone, except himself. And the only thing louder than his silence was the name he could never say again, Jimmy Hoffa. In the end, Frank the Irishman Sheeran lived not as a legend, but as a memory, half truth, half ghost. He spent his final years in a nursing home, wheelchair by the window, TV humming with stories that sounded too familiar. When a priest asked if he wanted to confess, Frank just smiled faintly. "I've said enough in my life," he whispered. "And maybe too much." He claimed he followed orders, that he never chose, only obeyed. But deep down, he knew every order was a choice, every silence a decision. The gun was only heavy because of what it carried, not bullets, but promises. Sometimes he'd look at the door and imagine Hoffa walking in, smiling, shouting, full of life again. Then he'd blink, and the room would be empty, the air still. Frank Sheeran outlived his friends, his enemies, even his purpose. He was proof that loyalty can build empires, and destroy souls. In his quiet way, he became what every man in his world feared most. Alone, remembered, but not forgiven. He outlived the world he built, not because he was lucky, but because he never broke his word. Don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more gangster stories like this one.